Have you ever wondered where true power really lies? Is it in your presence, commanding attention in every room you enter, your voice echoing through the halls of influence? Or could it be something far more mysterious, something that defies everything we think we know about control and authority? What if I told you that the most powerful man in medieval Scotland was one that nobody could find? A ghost who ruled from the shadows, a legend born not from what he did, but from what he refused to do. In the mist-covered Highlands of medieval Scotland, where ancient castles pierced the gray sky like stone daggers, and the wind carried whispers of old magic, there lived a man whose story would challenge everything the nobles thought they understood about power, influence, and the very nature of human desire. His name was Sir Roderick MacLeod, and by the end of his extraordinary tale, he would become known throughout the realm as the Shadow Lord, a figure so enigmatic that his very absence would speak louder than the combined voices of 1,000 men, and his silence would carry more weight than all the proclamations of kings. But Roderick's journey to legendary status began in the most unlikely place imaginable, with what most would consider complete and utter failure. Picture, if you will, a young man of 25, blessed with noble birth, moderate wealth, and reasonable intelligence, yet cursed with the most destructive trait a person seeking power could possess: the desperate need to always be seen, heard, and acknowledged. At 25, Roderick MacLeod was everything a medieval lord was expected to be in the most superficial sense. He was visible at every gathering, available for every consultation, and constantly present at the royal court of King Robert III. Like an eager puppy desperate for attention, he attended every meeting with religious devotion, rushed to every invitation with unseemly haste, and inserted himself into every discussion, whether his input was wanted or not. His voice could be heard in every debate, rising above others with increasing desperation. His opinion was known on every matter, from the most significant affairs of state to the most trivial court gossip. His face was a familiar sight in every corner of the royal court, in every antechamber, at every feast, during every ceremony. He had become the human equivalent of wallpaper, omnipresent yet invisible, constant yet forgettable. The other nobles had grown so accustomed to his perpetual presence that he had achieved the impossible feat of becoming invisible through his very visibility. And that was precisely why nobody took him seriously. That was exactly why his influence was non-existent. His words were ignored, and his presence was treated as nothing more than background noise in the great symphony of court politics. "Oh, here comes Roderick again," the other lords would mutter among themselves whenever they saw his eager face approaching their gatherings. He'll say the same things he always says, offer the same tired observations he always offers. His presence had become so ordinary, so predictable, so utterly routine, that he had essentially become a piece of furniture that everyone saw, but no one truly noticed. He was like the stones in the castle walls, always there, always visible, but never commanding attention or respect. The human mind, you see, has a cruel and ironic way of devaluing what is always available to it. We ignore the sun until it sets, and darkness reminds us of its importance. We forget about the air we breathe until our lungs burn for oxygen. We dismiss those who are always there, always available, always eager to please, until they disappear, and we suddenly realize what we've lost. This is not malice, but simple psychology. The brain is designed to filter out the routine, the predictable, the constantly present, in order to focus on what is new, rare, and potentially significant. Roderick had fallen victim to one of the most fundamental laws of human nature without even realizing it. By trying to be everything to everyone, by making himself constantly available, by never saying no to any request or invitation, He had paradoxically made himself worthless in the eyes of those he most wanted to impress. The night that would change Roderick's life forever, that would set in motion a transformation so complete it would be spoken of in whispers for generations, came during King Robert III's Grand Autumn Feast in the year of our Lord, 1387. The great hall was ablaze with candlelight, filled with the laughter of nobles, the clink of golden goblets, and the rich aroma of roasted meats. Tapestries depicting ancient battles hung from the stone walls, and the fire in the massive hearth cast dancing shadows across the faces of Scotland's most powerful men. Roderick, as always, was there, moving from group to group like a man desperately seeking validation, offering his thoughts on this matter and that, his voice growing slightly more shrill with each interaction as he sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that his words were falling on deaf ears. But it was while he stood hidden behind a massive stone pillar, having momentarily withdrawn to collect himself, that he overheard a conversation that would shatter his world and rebuild it in an entirely new configuration. His most trusted advisor, Lord Duncan Campbell, a man Roderick had considered a friend and ally, was speaking to a small circle of influential nobles. Campbell's voice carried clearly in the stone chamber, and his words cut through Roderick's soul like a blade forged in the fires of truth. "MacLeod?" Campbell laughed, a sound that held no warmth, only cruel amusement, as he took a long drink from his jewel-encrusted goblet. "That poor, desperate boy appears everywhere, but leaves no mark anywhere. He speaks constantly, but says nothing. He's always present, but never truly there. It's as if he never existed at all, as if he were some kind of phantom who haunts these halls without purpose or meaning." The other nobles chuckled in agreement, and one added, "Indeed, I sometimes forget he exists, even when he's standing right in front of me. His words pass through my mind like wind through wheat, leaving no impression whatsoever." Another lord nodded sagely. "It's remarkable, really. A man can be so visible that he becomes invisible, so present that he becomes absent. MacLeod has achieved the impossible. He has made himself disappear while standing in plain sight." The words hit Roderick like a bolt of lightning, splitting through his chest and illuminating every dark corner of his existence. In that moment, hidden behind cold stone, while listening to the brutal honesty of men who thought themselves unobserved, he understood a fundamental truth about human nature that would reshape his entire approach to power, influence, and the delicate art of command. Those who are always seen become invisible. Those who speak constantly are never truly heard. Those who are perpetually available become worthless, like coins so common they lose all value. The realization was so profound, so complete, that it felt like a religious awakening, a moment of clarity that illuminated not just his failures, but the path to his redemption. Standing there in the shadows, listening to his own irrelevance being discussed with casual cruelty, Roderick MacLeod died. Not literally, of course, but the man he had been, the eager, desperate, constantly present fool, ceased to exist in that moment. And from his ashes, something new began to take shape, something that would become legendary. The next morning dawned gray and misty, as Highland mornings often do, but it brought with it a transformation that would ripple through Scottish history like a stone cast into still water. Scotland witnessed one of the most dramatic metamorphoses in its long and bloody history, though at first, nobody noticed it was happening. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first whisper of winter in autumn air. Roderick MacLeod vanished, not in any dramatic fashion, not with proclamations or explanations, or tearful farewells. He didn't announce his intentions or make a great show of his departure. he simply stopped appearing. Like morning mist touched by sunlight, he dissolved from the visible world. He withdrew from court as quietly as a shadow retreating from dawn. He missed the meetings that he had never before failed to attend. He declined the invitations that he had previously accepted with embarrassing eagerness. He stopped inserting himself into discussions, stopped offering his opinions, stopped making himself available for consultation or conversation. The great wooden doors of his Highland castle, which had always stood open to visitors, remained firmly closed. The drawbridge that had once been lowered for any traveler now stayed raised. The windows that had once glowed with welcoming candlelight remained dark. No one could see him, speak to him, or even confirm that he still drew breath. For all anyone knew, Sir Roderick MacLeod had simply ceased to exist, had become one with the Highland mist that shrouded his domain. For the first week following his disappearance, his absence went completely unnoticed, which would have been crushing to the old Roderick, but was exactly what the new, transformed Roderick had expected. Nobody asked, "Where is Roderick?" because his presence had become so commonplace, so routine, so utterly predictable, that his absence felt normal, natural, unremarkable. The human brain, conditioned through months and years to filter out his constant chatter, simply didn't register that something fundamental had changed in the rhythm of court life. The daily meetings proceeded without him, and no one commented on his empty chair. The evening feasts continued in their usual fashion, and no one noticed that one familiar face was missing from the crowd. The consultations and debates carried on exactly as they had before, and no one realized that a voice which had once been part of every conversation was now silent. He had been so present that his absence initially felt like nothing more than a slight shift in the background noise of court life. But by the second week, something subtle began to shift in the collective consciousness of the court. The first whispers began, tentative and uncertain, like the first drops of rain before a storm. "Haven't seen MacLeod lately, have you?" Lord Hamilton mentioned casually to his companion as they walked through the castle corridors. "No, now that you mention it." "Where is he?" came the reply, tinged with mild curiosity. "Strange. He's usually everywhere at once." "Indeed, it's almost quiet without his constant commentary," Hamilton mused, and there was something in his tone that suggested this quiet was not entirely unwelcome, yet somehow notable. These conversations, brief and seemingly insignificant, began to multiply throughout the court. Like seeds scattered by wind, they took root in various minds and began to grow into something larger. The absence of someone who had been perpetually present created a kind of cognitive dissonance, a mental itch that demanded to be scratched. By the third week, curiosity had evolved into genuine concern and active speculation. The whispers had grown into conversations, and the conversations had begun to take on a life of their own. "Is MacLeod ill?" asked the Countess of Mar during her weekly salon. "Perhaps someone should inquire about his health." "I heard he might be on some secret mission for the crown," suggested Lord Fraser, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know how these Highland lords can be, full of mysterious purposes and hidden agendas." "Or maybe he's planning something significant," added the Earl of Lennox thoughtfully. "A man doesn't simply withdraw from court life without reason. MacLeod may not have been the most prominent voice in our discussions, but he's not without intelligence. Perhaps he's discovered something, learned something, that requires careful consideration away from prying eyes." This is the fascinating and seemingly illogical paradox of human psychology that Roderick had unconsciously stumbled upon, though he would not fully understand its implications for some time yet. We ignore what we have and obsess over what we've lost. We dismiss the familiar and romanticize the mysterious. We devalue the accessible and place premium worth on the scarce. The very qualities that had made Roderick forgettable when he was present, his predictability, his availability, his eagerness to please, now made his absence intriguing, valuable, and worthy of speculation. Where once his words had been dismissed as routine chatter, his silence now seemed pregnant with meaning. Where once his presence had been taken for granted, his absence now demanded explanation. Where once his opinions had been ignored, his unknown thoughts now seemed potentially profound. The transformation was not in Roderick himself, who was spending his days in his castle library, but in the minds of those who had once dismissed him. The fourth week brought the first real test of Roderick's newfound power through absence, though he could not have known it at the time. The Scottish Council was scheduled to convene for one of their most important sessions of the year, a meeting that would determine the Highland region's new taxation system, a decision that would affect thousands of lives and countless gold pieces flowing into the royal treasury. In the past, such a meeting would have been torture for the other lords, as Roderick would have dominated the discussion with his lengthy speeches, his repetitive arguments, his desperate attempts to be heard and acknowledged. He would have spoken for hours, cycling through the same points again and again, trying through sheer volume of words to force his opinions on others. The other lords had learned to simply wait out his verbal storms, nodding politely while their minds wandered to more pressing matters. But now, as the lords filed into the great council chamber, Roderick's chair remained empty. The sight of that vacant seat, which should have been a relief, instead seemed to cast a strange shadow over the proceedings. The silence where his voice should have been felt profound rather than peaceful. Lord Campbell, the same man who had dismissed Roderick so cruelly just weeks earlier, rose to address the assembled nobles. His voice carried a gravity that seemed disproportionate to the simple observation he was about to make. "Gentlemen," he began, his eyes lingering on the empty chair, "we cannot, in good conscience, make such an important decision without MacLeod's counsel. His perspective on Highland affairs has always been unique, and his absence from these deliberations feels like a significant oversight." The irony was exquisite, though Campbell himself seemed unaware of it. The man whose counsel he now deemed essential was the same man he had dismissed as worthless mere weeks before. But absence had transformed perception, had alchemized dismissal into respect, had turned the ignored into the indispensable. The Earl of Ross nodded gravely, stroking his graying beard. "Agreed completely. MacLeod's insight into Highland culture and customs could prove invaluable in crafting a taxation system that will be both effective and acceptable to the Highland clans. But where is he? Has anyone had word from him?" The Duke of Albany, a man known for his political cunning, leaned back in his ornate chair and spoke with the measured tones of someone accustomed to reading deeper meanings into surface events. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his words carrying the weight of careful consideration. "His silence itself is a message. MacLeod's absence might be telling us something profound about his position on this matter. A man of his intelligence doesn't simply withdraw from public life without reason. Could it be that his very refusal to participate is a form of commentary on our proposed policies?" The suggestion sent ripples through the assembled lords. Suddenly, Roderick's absence wasn't just mysterious, it was meaningful. His silence wasn't just notable, it was communicative. His withdrawal wasn't just curious, it was strategic. The empty chair had become more influential than the man who had once occupied it. That day, in one of the most surreal developments in the history of Scottish governance, critical decisions were made, based not on what Roderick MacLeod had said, but on what the assembled lords imagined he might be thinking. His phantom opinion, shaped entirely by collective speculation and projected meaning, carried more weight than his actual words had ever possessed. The council passed measures that they believed aligned with what the mysterious MacLeod might approve, though none of them had any real idea what his actual position might be. The taxation system that emerged from that meeting was, in many ways, more thoughtful and nuanced than it might have been with Roderick's physical presence and verbal input. The lords, forced to imagine what he might say, rather than endure what he actually did say, projected their own best thinking onto his absent persona. They gave him credit for wisdom he may not have possessed, for insights he may not have developed, for strategic thinking he may not have been capable of. As the weeks turned to months and summer gave way to autumn, Roderick's absence transformed from curiosity into legend. The longer he remained invisible, the larger he seemed to grow in the collective imagination of the court. People began calling him the Shadow Lord, a title that would have been mockery if applied to the old, constantly visible Roderick, but which seemed fitting and even fearsome when applied to the new, mysteriously absent one. Nobody knew what he was thinking, so everyone projected their own interpretations onto his silence. Nobody knew what he was planning, so everyone assumed he must be planning something significant. Nobody knew where he was or what he was doing, so everyone imagined activities far more important and interesting than the reality. The less they knew about him, the more they respected what they imagined he had become. MacLeod must be preparing some grand strategy, whispered Lady Margaret to her companions during an evening feast. A man doesn't withdraw from court life unless he's developing something that requires absolute secrecy and concentration. I heard he's been meeting secretly with Highland chieftains, added Lord Bruce, though he had heard no such thing and was merely speculating based on nothing more than the romance of mystery. Perhaps he's building some kind of alliance that will change the balance of power in Scotland. Or maybe he's having private audiences with the king, suggested the Earl of Angus, his voice heavy with implication. Think about it. When did you last see MacLeod at a public gathering? Never. But that doesn't mean he's not meeting with His Majesty in private. Perhaps his counsel has become so valuable that it's reserved for the king's ears alone. These speculations, built on nothing more substantial than wishful thinking and the human tendency to fill information gaps with dramatic possibilities, took on a life of their own. They spread through the court like wildfire, each retelling, adding new details, new possibilities, new reasons to view the absent Roderick with growing respect and even awe. The reality, of course, was far simpler, though in its simplicity lay a strategic brilliance that the old Roderick could never have achieved through his desperate machinations. The new Roderick was indeed in his Highland castle, but he wasn't meeting with chieftains or planning grand strategies or having secret audiences with the king. Instead, he was doing something that his previous constant social obligations had never allowed him the time or mental space to accomplish. He was thinking. For the first time in his adult life, Roderick had the luxury of uninterrupted contemplation. He spent his days in his castle's extensive library, reading works of philosophy, strategy, and statecraft that he had never had time to properly digest. He studied the great military minds of antiquity, absorbing lessons from Caesar and Alexander, from Sun Tzu and Vegetius. He pondered the political writings of Aristotle and Cicero, developing an understanding of power and governance that went far deeper than the superficial court knowledge he had possessed before. But more importantly, he was learning the most valuable lesson of all, the power of restraint, the strength that comes from knowing when not to act, when not to speak, when not to be present. He was developing the intellectual depth and strategic patience that his previous constant chatter and desperate attention-seeking had never allowed him to cultivate. The silence that others interpreted as mysterious and meaningful was, in fact, creating the very wisdom and depth that justified their interpretation. Lord Campbell, who had once dismissed Roderick as that poor boy who appears everywhere but leaves no mark anywhere, now spoke of him in entirely different terms when his name came up in conversation, which it increasingly did. MacLeod, Campbell would say, shaking his head with something approaching admiration, has always been deeper than we gave him credit for. I suspect his withdrawal from court life reflects a level of strategic thinking that we're only beginning to appreciate. The Highlands have produced many warriors, but perhaps in MacLeod they've produced something rarer, a true strategist, a man who understands that the most powerful moves are often the ones that remain unseen. The transformation in perception was so complete, so total, that it seemed to alter reality itself. The same man, possessing the same basic intelligence and capabilities, but now enhanced by the transformative alchemy of scarcity and mystery. Where once there had been familiarity breeding contempt, there was now rarity breeding reverence. 6 months after his disappearance, as winter began to tighten its grip on the Scottish Highlands and the first snows dusted the castle battlements white, Scotland faced a crisis that would test the true power of Roderick's accidental strategy. The crisis arrived like a perfect storm, with multiple threats converging simultaneously to threaten the very survival of the kingdom. English forces, led by the ambitious Earl of Northumberland, were gathering at the border in numbers not seen since the Wars of Independence. Their banners fluttered in the cold wind like harbingers of invasion, and their scouts had been spotted deep in Scottish territory. At the same time, internal rebellion was brewing in the lowlands, where several minor lords, sensing weakness in the crown, were quietly gathering their forces and making overtures to potential allies. Most dangerous of all, the kingdom's treasury was nearly empty, drained by years of poor harvests, costly defenses, and the general economic instability that had plagued Scotland for decades. King Robert III, a man more suited to peacetime governance than wartime leadership, found himself facing threats that seemed to dwarf his capabilities. Desperate for solutions, he gathered his most trusted advisors in the royal council chamber, the same room where Roderick's empty chair had wielded such mysterious influence months earlier. The king's advisors offered their counsel, each man providing his perspective on how to address the mounting crisis. Lord Campbell suggested immediate military mobilization, arguing that a show of strength might deter both external invasion and internal rebellion. The Earl of Ross advocated for diplomatic solutions, proposing negotiations with the English and concessions to the rebellious lords. The Duke of Albany recommended economic measures, including new taxes and the liquidation of royal assets to fund defensive preparations. Each proposal had merit, but none seemed adequate to address the full scope of the crisis. The king listened to each advisor with growing frustration, sensing that their conventional wisdom was insufficient to meet unconventional challenges. The weight of kingship had never felt heavier, and the loneliness of ultimate responsibility had never been more acute. It was then, as the discussion reached an impasse and the shadows lengthened across the council chamber, that King Robert III spoke the words that would change everything. What about MacLeod? What would he counsel in this situation? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication and expectation. 6 months earlier, such a question would have been met with barely concealed eye rolls and resigned sighs. Now, it was received with the gravity due to a matter of state security. Lord Campbell, who had become something of an unwitting spokesman for the MacLeod mystique, bowed his head respectfully. Unfortunately, Your Majesty, MacLeod has remained in complete seclusion since his withdrawal from court. Despite numerous attempts, no one has been able to establish contact with him. He has become, quite literally, unreachable. The king's frustration was evident in his voice. Surely there must be some way to communicate with him. A man of his obvious strategic capabilities could provide the perspective we desperately need. At that precise moment, as if summoned by the very desperation of the situation, a messenger arrived at court, carrying a simple piece of parchment. The paper was of good quality, but unremarkable, the writing clear, but unadorned. There was no elaborate seal, no ceremonial presentation, no dramatic flourish. Just a few simple lines that would prove more powerful than the most elaborate royal decree. If you truly have need of counsel, you know the old stone tower that stands where 3 valleys meet in the heart of the Highlands. Come alone when the moon is dark and the world sleeps. Bring no guards, no advisors, no retinue. What must be discussed requires solitude and discretion. R.M. The psychological impact of this simple message was immediate and profound. Here was a man who 6 months ago couldn't command the attention of a stable boy, now summoning the King of Scotland to a secret midnight meeting in the remote Highlands. The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that it seemed to bend reality around itself. The very conditions of the meeting, the demand for solitude, the mysterious location, the midnight timing, all served to elevate the importance of what would be discussed. A man who had once begged for audiences now required that the king come to him, alone, under conditions of his choosing. The scarcity of access had transformed Roderick from a supplicant into a treasure, from a nuisance into a necessity. King Robert III, a man who had rarely left his castle unaccompanied, and never for such a purpose, found himself planning a secret journey into the Highland wilderness. The very danger of such a venture, the break from royal protocol, the air of mystery and secrecy, all served to underscore the perceived importance of the man he was going to meet. 3 nights later, when the moon was nothing more than a sliver of silver in the star-filled sky, King Robert III rode alone through the Highland mists toward the ancient tower that stood sentinel where 3 valleys converged. The journey itself was treacherous, requiring him to navigate narrow mountain paths by starlight, to ford icy streams, and to trust his horse's instincts when the mist grew too thick to see the ground beneath them. The tower, when he finally reached it, was older than memory, built of massive stones, fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed to hold them in place. It had stood for centuries, weathering Highland storms and Highland wars, a monument to the endurance of those who had built it. Tonight, a single candle flickered in its highest window, a small beacon in the vast darkness of the Highland night. Inside the tower, illuminated by that single candle, and wrapped in shadows that seemed to dance with each flicker of flame, waited Roderick MacLeod. But this figure bore little resemblance to the man who had disappeared 6 months earlier. Where once there had been eager desperation, now there was calm authority. Where once there had been nervous energy and scattered attention, now there was focused intensity and deliberate composure. The months of solitude had transformed him in ways that went far deeper than mere appearance, though his appearance had indeed changed. His face had acquired the kind of thoughtful lines that come from serious contemplation rather than social anxiety. His posture reflected confidence rather than supplication. His entire presence radiated the kind of quiet power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the desperate undertones that had once marked his every utterance. Instead, it held the measured cadence of someone who had learned that words were tools to be used precisely, rather than weapons to be deployed frantically. "I have been expecting you, Your Majesty," Roderick said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Though I confess I had hoped the circumstances bringing us together might be less dire." The king was astounded by this greeting, so different from the eager flattery that had characterized their previous interactions. "How did you know I would come? How did you know I would need to come?" Roderick moved to the single window, gazing out at the Highland landscape bathed in starlight. "Because I too have been monitoring the threats facing our kingdom. The English mobilization, the internal dissent, the economic pressures, they are all part of a pattern that has been building for months. I withdrew from court not to escape these problems, but to find the mental space necessary to understand them fully and develop comprehensive solutions." He turned back to the king, and in the candlelight, his eyes held a depth of understanding that the old Roderick had never possessed. Some questions can only be answered in solitude, away from the noise of constant counsel and the distraction of perpetual debate. The solutions our kingdom needs require a level of strategic thinking that is impossible to achieve while caught up in the daily drama of court life. That night, in that ancient tower, while the Highland wind whispered secrets through the stone walls, Roderick MacLeod presented 3 comprehensive strategies that would fundamentally alter the course of Scottish history. Each strategy had been developed through months of careful study, deep contemplation, and the kind of systematic analysis that his previous scattered attention had never allowed him to pursue. The first strategy addressed the English threat through what Roderick termed asymmetric diplomacy. Rather than meeting English strength with Scottish strength in a conventional military confrontation that Scotland could not win, he proposed a series of secret negotiations designed to exploit divisions within the English leadership. He had identified key English nobles who harbored their own ambitions and resentments against the Earl of Northumberland, and he outlined a plan to turn these internal English conflicts to Scotland's advantage. The plan involved offering certain English lords territorial concessions in exchange for their withdrawal from Northumberland's coalition, effectively fragmenting the English forces before they could be brought to bear against Scotland. The second strategy dealt with the internal rebellion through what he called selective legitimacy. Instead of treating all the rebellious lords as equals, his plan involved carefully analyzing their individual motivations, capabilities, and vulnerabilities, then crafting specific responses to each. Some rebels would be offered generous terms and brought back into the royal fold. Others would be isolated and neutralized through political maneuvering, and still others would be allowed to exhaust themselves in futile gestures while their support quietly evaporated. The third strategy tackled the economic crisis through a revolutionary approach to royal finance that combined traditional Scottish resources with innovative new revenue streams. Rather than simply raising taxes or liquidating assets, Roderick proposed a comprehensive program that would stimulate economic growth while simultaneously increasing royal revenues. The plan included everything from new trade agreements with continental powers to the establishment of royal monopolies on certain Highland products that were increasingly in demand throughout Europe. Each strategy was not just brilliant in its conception, but comprehensive in its detail. Roderick had spent his months of isolation working out not just the broad outlines of these plans, but their specific implementation, their potential complications, their contingency measures, and their long-term implications. They were the product of sustained intellectual effort, of a kind that his previous, scattered, socially driven existence had never permitted. The king listened to these presentations with growing amazement, not just at their strategic sophistication, but at the transformation they represented in the man delivering them. This was not the same person who had once desperately sought approval through constant presence and endless chatter. This was a strategic mind of the highest order, someone who had learned to think in terms of systems and patterns rather than immediate reactions and social dynamics. When Roderick finished his presentations, The tower fell silent except for the whisper of wind through stone and the soft flickering of candlelight. The king sat in contemplation for several minutes, absorbing not just the content of what he had heard, but its implications for his understanding of power, wisdom, and the mysterious ways in which human potential can be transformed. Finally, King Robert III spoke. "These strategies are remarkable, MacLeod. They address our problems not just individually, but as interconnected challenges requiring coordinated solutions. But I must ask, why present them to me here in secret, rather than before the full council, where they could receive proper discussion and refinement?" Roderick smiled, and there was something in that smile that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Because, Your Majesty, the value of these strategies lies not just in their content, but in their source. If I were to present them publicly, they would be subjected to the same kind of dismissive analysis that once greeted all my contributions to council discussions. They would be picked apart not on their merits, but based on preconceptions about their author. By presenting them to you privately, I allow their value to speak for itself, free from the contamination of previous expectations." The king nodded slowly, beginning to understand not just the strategic brilliance of the plans themselves, but the strategic brilliance of their presentation. "And what of your return to public life? Surely you don't intend to remain in isolation forever?" "That," Roderick replied, "depends entirely on how these strategies are received and implemented. If they prove successful, my reputation will be established on a foundation of demonstrated competence rather than desperate self-promotion. If they fail, I will have learned valuable lessons while maintaining the option of continued development in private." The two men spent the remainder of the night discussing implementation details, potential obstacles, and contingency plans. As dawn broke over the Highland peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, King Robert III prepared to return to his capital, carrying with him not just 3 revolutionary strategies, but a new understanding of how absence could create presence, how silence could amplify voice, and how withdrawal could generate influence. The next day, King Robert III presented the 3 strategies to his council, though he carefully managed their attribution. He spoke of them as having emerged from deep consultation with sources whose wisdom has been proven through careful observation and patient analysis. He did not mention Roderick by name, but neither did he claim the strategies as his own creation. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Lord Campbell leaped to his feet in excitement, his face flushed with the kind of enthusiasm that had been notably absent from recent council meetings. "These strategies are masterful, Your Majesty. They address our challenges with a sophistication and comprehensiveness that I confess I had not thought possible. The diplomatic approach to the English threat is particularly brilliant, using their own internal divisions against them rather than meeting their strength head-on. But I must ask, who developed these plans? What mind could conceive such interconnected solutions?" The king smiled with a mysterious satisfaction that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Sometimes, Lord Campbell, the greatest wisdom emerges from the deepest silence. Perhaps the question is not who created these strategies, but why we have been unable to develop such thinking within our regular deliberations." The implication was clear, though unstated. The constant chatter and immediate reactions that characterized normal council meetings were antithetical to the kind of deep, systematic thinking that had produced these solutions. The very social dynamics that had made the old Roderick invisible and ineffective were the same dynamics that prevented the kind of strategic development that the kingdom desperately needed. Over the following weeks, all 3 strategies were implemented with remarkable precision and even more remarkable success. The asymmetric diplomacy campaign succeeded beyond even Roderick's optimistic projections. key English nobles, their own ambitions and resentments, skillfully exploited through secret negotiations, withdrew their support from the Earl of Northumberland's planned invasion. The English coalition fragmented, internal conflicts erupted, and what had seemed like an unstoppable military threat dissolved into a series of manageable diplomatic problems. The selective legitimacy approach to the internal rebellion proved equally effective. Some rebellious lords offered generous terms that addressed their specific grievances, returned to royal service with renewed loyalty. Others found themselves isolated, as their potential allies were systematically drawn away through targeted incentives. The few who remained committed to rebellion discovered that their cause had lost both momentum and support, leaving them vulnerable to conventional military action that could be applied with overwhelming local superiority. The economic reforms produced results that exceeded even the king's most optimistic expectations. New trade agreements brought unprecedented revenue flows into the royal treasury. Highland products, marketed through royal monopolies with continental sophistication, became luxury items commanding premium prices throughout Europe. The kingdom's financial crisis transformed into fiscal strength virtually overnight. Scotland had been saved not through conventional wisdom or traditional approaches, but through the innovative thinking of a man who had learned to think systematically rather than reactively, strategically rather than tactically, comprehensively rather than partially. The invisible hand that had guided this salvation belonged to someone who had gained power by learning when not to exercise it, who had achieved influence by understanding when to withdraw from the exercise of influence. Word of the kingdom's remarkable recovery spread throughout the court, but the source of the strategies remained mysterious. The king maintained his discretion about their true origin, speaking only of profound counsel from sources whose wisdom has been tested by time and proven by results. This careful ambiguity only served to deepen the growing legend of the Shadow Lord, as speculation about Roderick's role in recent events reached fever pitch. Within months, Sir Roderick MacLeod was recognized throughout Scotland as the kingdom's most valuable strategic advisor, though he never returned to his old patterns of constant visibility and desperate attention-seeking. Instead, he had learned the most valuable lesson that any person seeking true influence can master: the art of strategic scarcity. He continued to appear rarely at court, perhaps once or twice a month at most, and only for matters of genuine significance. When word spread that MacLeod is coming to court, it became an event that commanded universal attention. Nobles would rearrange their schedules to ensure they could witness whatever pearls of wisdom might fall from his lips. His arrivals were treated with the kind of reverence typically reserved for visiting royalty or religious figures. The contrast with his previous incarnation could not have been more stark. Where once his constant presence had made him invisible, his rare appearances now made him unforgettable. Where once his endless chatter had rendered his words meaningless, his carefully chosen statements now carried the weight of prophecy. Where once his desperate availability had made him worthless, his selective accessibility had made him invaluable. Each appearance became a masterclass in the power of restraint and the value of strategic timing. Roderick would arrive at court with the kind of quiet confidence that spoke of inner certainty rather than external validation. He would listen more than he spoke, observe more than he participated, and when he did offer his thoughts, they were delivered with the kind of measured precision that comes from careful contemplation rather than immediate reaction. Lord Campbell, who had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation in his perception of Roderick, now introduced him at court functions as Scotland's greatest strategic mind and the architect of our kingdom's renaissance. The same man who had once dismissed Roderick as a worthless phantom now spoke of him with genuine reverence, and there was no sense of irony or embarrassment in this complete reversal of opinion. The psychological transformation in how others perceived Roderick was so complete that it seemed to alter objective reality. Nobles who had once ignored his presence now hung on his every word. Advisors who had once dismissed his contributions now sought his approval for their own proposals. Even King Robert III, who had once barely acknowledged Roderick's existence, now considered him an indispensable counselor, whose wisdom was essential to the kingdom's continued prosperity. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roderick's transformation was how he had learned to manage his own psychology. The old Roderick had been driven by insecurity, by a desperate need for external validation that made him pathetically eager to please everyone and ultimately successful at pleasing no one. The new Roderick had developed an inner confidence that came not from the approval of others, but from his own proven competence and strategic thinking. He had learned to find satisfaction in results rather than recognition, in effectiveness rather than visibility, in genuine influence rather than apparent importance. This psychological shift was perhaps more revolutionary than any of his strategic innovations because it freed him from the self-defeating patterns that had previously undermined his every effort to achieve real power. Years passed, and Roderick's legend continued to grow. Stories of his strategic brilliance spread throughout Scotland and beyond, taking on almost mythical proportions as they traveled from court to court, from castle to castle, from one generation of nobles to the next. He became known not just as the Shadow Lord, but as the Ghost King, the Invisible Hand, the Silent Counselor, whose wisdom shaped kingdoms from behind veils of mystery and discretion. Young nobles would travel hundreds of miles for the mere possibility of catching a glimpse of him during one of his rare public appearances. Aspiring strategists would study his known decisions like sacred texts, trying to decode the principles that guided his thinking. Foreign diplomats would delay important negotiations if there was any chance that the legendary MacLeod might be consulted on the matter. The irony of his situation was not lost on Roderick himself. He had achieved everything he had desperately sought during his earlier incarnation, but only by learning to stop seeking it directly. He had gained the respect, influence, and recognition that had once eluded him, but only by discovering that these things came as byproducts of genuine competence rather than as rewards for desperate striving. More importantly, he had learned to value these achievements differently. Where once he had sought external validation as an end in itself, he now understood that true satisfaction came from the knowledge that his work had genuine value, that his contributions made real differences in the lives of real people, that his strategic thinking helped solve real problems rather than merely advancing his own social position. The aging Lord Campbell, reflecting on the extraordinary transformation he had witnessed, would often tell younger courtiers this story. Once there was a lord named MacLeod, who was always among us, but never truly seen. He spoke constantly, but was never heard. He appeared everywhere, but left no impression anywhere. Then one day, he simply vanished, and in his absence, he became the most powerful man in Scotland. That's when I learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in being present, but in knowing precisely when to be absent. As Roderick entered his later years, his reputation had become so firmly established that even his eventual death would not diminish it. When Sir Roderick MacLeod passed away peacefully in his Highland castle in 1420, aged 58, the entire nobility of Scotland attended his funeral. Kings and commoners alike came to pay their respects to a man who had revolutionized their understanding of power, influence, and the subtle arts of leadership. Even in death, he maintained the mysterious aura that had defined his transformation. His will specified that he be buried in a simple grave with no elaborate monument, no lengthy inscription, just a modest stone bearing these words: "Here lies a man who learned to exist through absence, to speak through silence, and to lead by knowing when to follow." The funeral itself became a study in the power of restraint. There were no lengthy eulogies, no dramatic displays of grief, no elaborate ceremonies. Instead, there was a profound silence that seemed to echo with the weight of genuine respect and authentic admiration. The assembled mourners understood, perhaps instinctively, that this was exactly how Roderick would have wanted to be remembered. Not through grand gestures or flowery speeches, but through the quiet recognition of a life that had discovered how to achieve maximum impact through minimum display. In the years following his death, Roderick's story became a cornerstone of Scottish political wisdom, passed down from one generation of leaders to the next as an object lesson in the counterintuitive nature of true power. His strategies were studied, his methods analyzed, his psychological insights incorporated into the training of young nobles who sought to understand how influence really worked in the complex world of medieval politics. But perhaps his most enduring legacy lay not in any specific strategy or tactical innovation, but in the fundamental principle he had discovered through his own painful experience: that human beings consistently overvalue what is scarce and undervalue what is abundant, that we ignore what is always available and desire what is difficult to obtain, that we dismiss the familiar and romanticize the mysterious. This principle, which modern psychologists would later term scarcity bias, had been intuitively understood and masterfully exploited by a medieval Scottish lord who stumbled upon it through personal humiliation and transformed it into a source of legendary power. Roderick's story demonstrated that the same psychological mechanisms that can destroy a person's influence when misunderstood can become the foundation of extraordinary power when properly comprehended and strategically applied. Today, in our hyper-connected digital age, where everyone struggles to be seen, heard, and acknowledged across an endless array of social media platforms and professional networks, Roderick MacLeod's transformation offers lessons that are more relevant than ever. We live in a world where constant posting, endless networking, and perpetual availability have become the norm, where people measure their worth by likes, shares, and comments, where the fear of missing out drives ever more frantic efforts to be everywhere at once. Yet the fundamental psychology that Roderick discovered remains unchanged. The person who posts constantly on social media becomes background noise, their content filtered out by algorithms and human attention alike. The professional who accepts every meeting, responds to every email immediately, and makes themselves perpetually available, gradually diminishes their perceived value in the minds of colleagues and clients. The individual who tries to be all things to all people ends up being nothing special to anyone. Conversely, those who understand the power of strategic absence, who choose their appearances carefully, who speak rarely but meaningfully, who make their accessibility a privilege rather than a given, often find that their influence grows exponentially. The social media account that posts rarely but with exceptional quality commands more attention than those that post constantly. The consultant who is selective about their availability commands higher fees than those who are always on call. The executive who speaks selectively in meetings finds their words carry more weight than those of colleagues who comment on everything. The principle extends beyond individual behavior to organizations, products, and even entire industries. Luxury brands maintain their appeal partly through scarcity and exclusivity. Limited edition products generate more desire than mass market alternatives. Companies that are selective about their clients often command premium prices compared to those that accept all comers. Roderick's story reminds us that in a world obsessed with visibility and constant connectivity, there is extraordinary power in knowing when to withdraw, when to remain silent, when to be absent. It suggests that our influence often depends less on how much we say or do than on making what we say and do genuinely valuable and strategically timed. The Shadow Lord's legacy challenges us to examine our own relationship with presence and absence, with speaking and listening, with action and restraint. It asks us to consider whether our constant efforts to be seen and heard might actually be diminishing our impact, whether our fear of being forgotten might be preventing us from being truly memorable. In our age of information, overload, and attention deficit, perhaps the most radical act is not to speak louder or appear more frequently, but to develop the confidence and strategic wisdom to know when silence will speak more eloquently than words, when absence will command more attention than presence, when restraint will generate more power than action. Sir Roderick MacLeod discovered that the most profound influence often comes not from what we do, but from what we choose not to do. His transformation from ignored supplicant to legendary strategist offers a timeless lesson about the counterintuitive nature of power and the enduring value of strategic scarcity in a world that consistently mistakes activity for achievement, noise for significance, and presence for influence. The question that his story poses to each of us is simple yet profound. In our efforts to be seen and heard, have we made ourselves invisible and voiceless? In our fear of being absent, have we ensured that our presence lacks meaning? And most importantly, do we have the wisdom and courage to discover the power that lies hidden in the shadows of our own strategic restraint? The Shadow Lord's greatest victory was not any particular battle he won or strategy he devised, but the personal transformation that allowed him to understand that true power often lies not in what we grasp, but in what we choose to release, not in what we say, but in what we choose not to say, not in where we appear, but in where we choose not to appear. His story endures because it speaks to the eternal human struggle between the desire for recognition and the pursuit of genuine effectiveness, between the fear of being forgotten and the wisdom of knowing, when forgetting can be the foundation of being truly remembered. In learning to disappear, Roderick MacLeod discovered how to become unforgettable, and in that paradox lies perhaps the most valuable lesson about power, influence, and the mysterious ways in which absence can become the most compelling form of presence.